Thank you, Colin, Sir Colin, for your inspiring talk. Now it's time for questions.
Yes, Professor, very interesting. Is there any evidence, in fact, that our brains might still be evolving? And because from what you're saying, it sounds as if even if I learn some new skill and enhance my own cognitive functions, that enhancement would not be passed on to my children. Right. But is there not a possibility that that could be happening?
Okay. I think you have to distinguish between genetic variation, which is happening all the time in every species, and speciation, the creation of a new species. And in fact, Darwin, a lot of the criticism of Darwin when he first proposed his ideas was yes, of course, variations, natural selection might explain the variations in individuals, plants when they're selected for different colors, and so that's fine. But creating a new species seems, that was the criticism, to need something very different. And there have, of course, been genetic changes. Just look at the phenotype of a white Caucasian, Scandinavian Caucasian, compared with the Chinese, compared with black African. I mean, there clearly have been genetic modifications around the world which have been local adaptations to the environment that have happened after the speciation event 200,000 years ago. I think it's interesting to ask, and may be answerable, whether any of the enormously important cultural steps, such as the explosion of art from about 60,000 years ago, the development of reading and writing 3,500 years ago, whether agriculture 15,000 years ago, whether some of these enormously important steps might have been associated with some sort of genetic reorganization, not comparable to a new species, but a very small reorganization. And it might not have involved anything dramatic or even visible. For instance, the plasticity of the brain depends on the ability to change the strength of connections between nerve cells. That process, which we know a lot about, is regulated by a large variety of genetic mechanisms, the exact way in which it's done. You could imagine a small tweak in one of the processes, the change of a subunit of a receptor or something, which would slightly change the temporal dynamics of the modification process, which might conceivably make it able to do different sorts of computations. So I don't think we should rule out completely the possibility of genetic changes underlying local adaptation, mental, as it were, adaptations and changes in the human species. That raises, of course, the politically incorrect possibility that some aspects of cognition have evolved separately in different parts of the world. Because the common factor we all have is our origins in Africa. I mean, the crucial speciation event took place on the savannah or whatever in East Africa. I think there's so much general agreement on that. But if we're saying there could have been genetic changes, they would have happened after human beings had spread across the whole world. So they're unlikely to have happened simultaneously in all humans. They might have happened in one place but not another. So we shouldn't rule out the possibility that there are genetically influenced local cognitive specializations around the world which make us different from each other, but not comparable to a whole formation of a new species. It's difficult to express these ideas without being worried about being accused of being politically incorrect. But I think it's worth looking at. I mean, it's really interesting, and it doesn't just mean that one group will necessarily be far superior in everything, because there could have been genetic variations which led to specialized development, but different in different parts of the world.
Next question.
Professor, thank you for a very interesting talk. More questions on the same topic about evolution. I had two questions there. One is, I don't know if I missed something in the talk, but how do we conclude that the brain now and 200,000 years back, that it's identical? I mean, what sort of evidence can lead to that conclusion? And the second one is, when we talk about 200,000 years, and again, I'm not very familiar with evolution, but the time scales of evolution is 200,000 years too small to detect a quantifiable or a detectable change in the brain? Is it too small to detect a change? Maybe it's happening and we can't detect it yet. Is that possible?
Yeah. Okay, well, how do we know that the brain is similar? And it's true, we don't have, intact brain specimens from that. All we have is the skulls. So all we can talk about is volume, which is a pretty, crude indicator. But, it's good enough to know that the brain has changed by 10% in size, and it hasn't. I mean, if anything, actually, brains are getting smaller. But the evidence seems to suggest that there's a decrease in average, but it's a very small decrease in average skull size, which is surprising because we're getting bigger. I mean, physically, we're bigger because of nutrition and so on, and there is a relationship between body size and brain size. So that's a little bit worrying, perhaps. But it's true that maybe, I mean, I give us the same answer in a way before. I mean, there might have been some significant but small genetic reorganizations which perhaps were invisible in terms of the gross structure of the brain, but which could have changed the efficiency of the computational process in the brain. I mean, another good, so a specific example. The thickness of the insulating layer on nerve fibers, the myelin layer on nerve fibers, influences the speed of conduction of nerve impulses. So small variations in average thickness of myelin could have increased the speed with which the brain could compute and allow more steps in the computational processes. And that would be impossible to detect on the basis of just skull size alone. So there are many ways in which brains could have been subtly altered in their efficiency after the speciation step 200,000 years ago. It's true.
Next one. This is student.
Hello. Hello, I'm a physics student from Hong Kong U, and a few months ago, my professor had shown me a paper that GRE results of physics does not predict any success in academic world in physics and astronomy. So my question is there any evidence that the structural or functional difference in our brain can predict the academic performance So is it possible to build an algorithm based on the imaging data to predict academic success or even job performance?
You mean should all universities have a scanner at the when they're admitting students? Have to have a brain scan before you can get into City University, perhaps. I think the short answer is no, but that doesn't mean that there's no relationship. After all, if you have no brain, you're probably not going to make a very good student. You've got a normal-sized brain, you have a much better chance. But the people have looked very, long and hard at the relationship between superlative intelligence and exceptional intelligence and brain structure on the basis of a small number of samples. It's true, but there's no clear. I mean, Einstein's brain was very modest in size, I'm afraid. So you can't tell by looking at gross structure about individual differences. But what we all have is these extra modules that mice and hedgehogs and so on don't have. They might vary a bit in relative size between individuals, but at least we have all of them. I mean, an individual who has a relatively small brain doesn't have a small brain because they're missing 3 or 4 of the computing modules. Everything's a little bit smaller. So if there's redundancy in brain structure, then it might not be a disadvantage to have smaller areas. And again, maybe what was special about Einstein was nothing to do with size, but something very subtle like computing speed. Learnt networks that underpinned certain sorts of mathematical abilities that other people couldn't, which were invisible in terms of brain structure. And that might have involved quite small numbers of neurons.
I think Einstein was not a good student.
No,
but it's not like. Okay, so thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And at some point you alluded to artificial intelligence. You mentioned computer scientists are trying to understand what is so special with humans. I would appreciate to have your comments on artificial intelligence, because there has been a lot of disappointment. People said, no, it's impossible. And now there are great expectations again.
Yeah.
So with your experience and of neuroscience, are you optimistic about artificial intelligence, or you think it will never be like human?
Well, I mean, you judge it by what it can do, and the fact is there have been really quite remarkable developments in the last, say, 10 years. And we tend to be skeptical because of the early promises of very rapid achievement. John McCarthy, who was the first person to use the term artificial intelligence in 1957 or something, said, within 5 years we'll have computers that are literally more intelligent in every respect than human beings. That was just obviously over-optimistic. But I mean, there have been really significant developments, largely hardware developments, so that the computer power is just so much larger and faster than it was before. That's helped a lot. But also new approaches to programming, to software architecture. The whole principle of network learning is a crucial development. So deep learning algorithms and so on can be extremely efficient. And if you can just make them massively larger and faster than human brains, you can make them do things, I think, by methods that are very different from the human brain, but in the end come up as good or even better than humans, just because they can do so many more operations in the time available. So I don't think we should ruin. I think AI is going to continue to make enormous progress, but not. My feeling is that the major progress is not going to be made through trying to literally simulate human brains in computational architecture. I think the two things have diverged. There is real interest in the computational field amongst computational neuroscientists in simulation to try to gain more understanding about how the brain really does things. But quite in parallel, the Google, the deep learners and so on just go off on their own trajectory using techniques like backpropagation or whatever, which are physiologically unreasonable, but which do a wonderful job when you can incorporate them in the architecture. So I think we'll get this divergence, but the straight, hard AI approach, I think, is going to continue to be remarkably successful.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm economist, so I don't understand the biology and the brain stuff. But your talk towards the end, that human pass on their knowledge to the next generation because of language, reminds me of a book that I read when I was a student in the mid-70s. And they gave an example saying that, look at the chicken. If they run across the street and get run over by cars, how many millions of years would it take for them to change their genetics in order to avoid that? But for humans, it's very simple. Just tell your little kids, don't run around, right?
Exactly.
But let me ask you a question. Now, you talk about, the human brain and the function that we kind of, implicitly in it, you have some function to perform. So, but when we think about the theory of survival, evolution, it seems to be quite in terms of numbers. That if this species is good, it's prosper, but for human being, we probably go beyond the number, quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
So, but are we getting to some thread that we bring back religion, and that's a purpose? Evolution with a purpose? Because why your brain perform in a particular direction? Why not be so random? Is there a purpose behind? Right?
Well, I very deliberately avoided phrases like intelligent design, even while saying that I was going to argue that a pure Darwinian approach can't explain human. But I'm not religious, and I see arguments in terms of design and meaning and intention as representing an inability to find any other explanation. And as a scientist, I think that there's a responsibility to try to find other explanations. Science has done an amazing job of finding other explanations that were previously thought to be due to something magical. And yes, there's a lot about human beings which is pretty remarkable and strange and very difficult to explain, but I don't think we should give up on science yet. And okay, straightforward Darwinism I don't think can explain the difference between modern human beings and Neolithic human beings, but I'm not sure you need God to explain the difference either. But that's a personal view.
Hello, actually I'm evolutionary biology student in UCLA. And
So you should be giving the lecture, yes?
no, actually I was so curious about the human brain. Actually, when you go to Homo sapien 200,000 years ago, actually the brain size increased dramatically. And I'm just wondering, does any chemical or maybe any social structure change in the Homo sapien from the Homo habilis so that the human can find more resources to support the brain? Because this is what I learned from a course.
You're absolutely right, and I didn't answer my own question. I raised the problem that a big increase in brain size puts an enormous burden on that species, on that group,
right.
And you'd normally expect it to be selected against. That burden still existed, and clearly the brain was not being used as fully as it could have been. There wasn't an environmental niche for it to be used in the way that we now use the brain. So why weren't we selected against? And I think there are two possible explanations. One, yours, that resources were so easily available that essentially the human organism was not metabolically limited in the same way that has operated through most of evolution. And it's thought that the environment of early humans was incredibly clement. It was easy, it was relatively easy life. Temperature, remember, high altitude, temperature very steady and reasonable, a ready water supply. They lived around the edges of lakes in general, it's thought. Lots of vegetation, so easy regular food supply, but the availability of game, which they could hunt, very rich game resources. Food already mastered by erectors, so they could cook their food, so they could have a very highly efficient source of energy from cooked food. So you could argue that it didn't matter, that they carried the brain as a kind of spandrel. You know, it happened, it was a genetic mutation. Yes, it consumed more food and so on, that had to be provided, but it didn't matter because resources were so rich, right? I think that's part of the story. But there's another one, and that is the other Darwinian explanation for odd things, apparently unfunctional things like peacock tails, for instance. Yeah, and what's the explanation of that?
Well, actually, because peacock tail is the indicator of the good genes. If you can invest so much in the more expensive trail like the peacock tails, you can solve to the female that you are capable of.
Exactly, but it's sexual selection. It's an indicator, it's a signal of your special status to the opposite sex. Is it possible, is it crazy that some distinctive feature of face structure or whatever associated with the increase in brain size became a secondary sexual characteristic?
Actually, I just come up with one idea, but I'm not sure if this is okay. I'm just thinking about, because when you're talking about the art and also innovation, it has happened just after the Homo sapien. Maybe Homo neanderthals have the capital of art as well, but I'm thinking about nowadays when we try to get a girlfriend, we try to think about how to create art, music, or even use the verbal power to attract the girl. I'm just thinking about maybe that kind of brain power is one of the sexual selection child.
Yeah, it's possible. I think it is worth thinking about the secondary impact of large heads that had nothing to do with the extra intelligence. I mean, we know that the structure of the face is in embryogenesis is very much related to and modified by growth of the brain. I mean, a lot of genetic abnormalities of brain development are characterized by changes in face structure. They're immediately recognized by physicians from the face structure changes, because the two things are linked during embryogenesis. So human beings amongst the population where presumably the genetics was varied at the time of speciation, those humans that had larger heads would also have had differently shaped faces. And perhaps that became a distinctive signal, sexual signal, that made them more successful in reproduction. Possibly.
Thank you.
I believe many of you still have many questions, but due to time limit, I only last one question, please.
Hello, sir. Sir, how come can we know that millions of years before the brain size was so small or something like that? Do we have enough samples statistically sufficient to conclude that millions of years? Do we have those skulls that conclude that millions of years before brains were small and those evolved with time?
The numbers are a problem here. I mean, the graphs are nice, so there are some dots on. You have to remember that each one of those dots is one whole specimen. And then there are not many, there are a few hundred or whatever over the whole of the data set. And then you say, well, what is this specimen? And in many cases, it's a small fragment of the back of a skull, some small little bit from which you have to make all kinds of assumptions in order to derive your estimate of brain size. So the data are not very good. I mean, it would be nice to have much more data. But I think if there had been, if there had been lots of individuals with large heads at much earlier stages, then we would have examples of them. And interestingly, I should show you the Oppenheimer picture again. There are one or two individuals with quite good specimens, much earlier than 200,000 years ago, that have heads almost as big as modern Homo sapiens. But with a single sample, amongst all of these, and in different parts of Africa as well, suggesting that occasionally there had been, over a single generation maybe, an increase in brain size, but it hadn't succeeded locally. It had been wiped out very quickly, leaving very, very few examples. The surprising thing about sapiens is that the large brain size change wasn't lethal, and it persisted, even if not fully used in the way that it can be in the future. So I think it's possible that there are earlier examples, but they just didn't flourish, perhaps because the energetic demands of the large brain couldn't be overcome, so they became wiped out.
Okay, may we once again thank Sir Colin for his inspiring lecture. Now I'd like to invite the President to present the souvenir to the Sir Colin to show our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's kind of you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, finally, thanks to all of you for coming to the lecture, and looking forward to see you in the next lecture.